Hi, Farah. I'm so happy to have you on the podcast today. How are you feeling?
I'm okay, and I'm so excited to be here. It's been such a long time since we've seen each other.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So for those of you listening, I'm going to introduce Farah. She is an artist doula, a shift disturber, a cultural stripper, a mommy, a fire starter, and a warrior. She's an international public speaker and consultant, shifting mindsets and stripping away biases to increase resilience, inclusion, and justice. For 25 years, she's been using creativity to reveal and resolve barriers to equity, fostering economic, professional, and personal development while improving belonging and sparking innovation. So there's a lot of what you do, Farah. There's so much of what you do, especially around committing to building diverse communities of leaders who are, as you say, fierce and flawsome without limiting their beliefs or without limiting beliefs, self-doubt or shame. Can you talk to us a little bit about that specifically?
Yeah, what I say is that we can be fearless and flawsome. And for those of you who've never heard that term flawsome before, it's that we're all flawed because we all are. Nobody is perfect. And at the same time, we can be awesome. But I'll specify that that awesomeness comes from the moment and time that we are in now, because we're constantly learning, we're constantly revealing what is changing and what has changed from 5 minutes ago, 5 years ago, 500 years ago. So we can only work with what we know now in the moment in time and move forward from there. So in that respect, it's almost like we're constantly in the past, moving forward. It's not a question of creating these binaries of past, present, future, because that in itself can get confusing. Am I living in the present? Am I grounded? Am I doing the right thing for the moment? Am I setting myself up for the future? Instead, if we think that we're always moving forward or flowing forward from the past, sometimes that in itself becomes more of an interesting way of looking at things. And so that way, everything we do in the past has meaning, and everything that we have done has many meaning, and everything we do in the future will have meaning too.
Mm-hmm. How does that play out, like in a training, for example? How do you teach that?
How do I teach how we move forward?
Yeah.
Well, I think that it's a different methodology in teaching. I'll give you an example. I was running a cohort with a colleague of mine on decolonizing. And this was a session that was to set people up to decolonize.
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily that you attend these 2 sessions and therefore you are decolonized and you've checked, you've got the certificate and you move forward from there.
Yeah.
And one of the things that was really interesting when we got the evaluation back by the first cohort that we ran is that people were saying that I expected this or I expected that. Like a lot of people had fun, they learned a lot of information, but they still had that expectation of being taught in a colonized manner. Sometimes when we teach in a decolonized manner, we don't tell everything. You have to absorb what you're ready to absorb, again, in that moment in time. And some things may reveal to you in your own time. So could come to you 10 years from now, something that we talk about in this conversation. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, I get it. Because I think that what happens right now, we're so focused on technology. We're so focused on getting everything through our Google or Firefox searches, getting the information at our fingertips, being told what to do, that we don't take that time to think and really process it, not only with our brain, but also with our minds, wherever our minds happen to be, with our heart, with our body, with our spirit. We don't take that time anymore. And so we don't let things really sink in when we make decisions. And we don't always make decisions based on what our DNA, what our generational knowledge leads us to do that would be keeping in the wellness of who we are as individuals.
Yeah.
So I know that that's speaking really metaphorically.
I like it. What it brings up for me is like people sometimes expect to be poured into.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, have you found in your work that that comes to benefit for that individual?
Absolutely not. People need to come to conclusions themselves. They need to have their own ahas. And that happens when the body's ready to receive it.
That's right. And it also happens when we ask good questions.
Yeah.
Do you know the concept of asking good questions?
Say something about that.
I'll give an information for those folks who don't know. Like, I mean, of course, people want to ask good questions, but sometimes I wonder if they've really thought about the question that they've asked. So what we term in terms of Indigenous knowledge of good questions would be something where you don't know what the answer is going to be. And no matter what the answer is, you accept it. So if you're going to ask somebody with the expectation that you're hoping they're going to give you a particular answer, or you're asking a question to make yourself look good, or you're asking a question because you want to show a certain aspect of yourself, or you're asking a question to get an answer to create a transaction because you already anticipate what they're talking about so that you can ask a follow-up question or give information about something about yourself, those aren't good questions. The questions where you really don't know the answer and you really want to know what the other person's opinion is, those are good questions. So we have to be able to open ourselves up to receive the answer to those good questions. Yeah. If we don't, then we're not going to move forward.
Yeah. And like, you know, I wrote down questions with agendas. Right? Like we have an agenda behind it. We're anticipating, we're already in the future instead of really being here just with the person, just with that curiosity and just the holding of space for the person to generate their own responses and to then receive them.
Absolutely. So going back to this fearless and flawsomeness, that's thinking about how we can be flawed enough to accept that we don't know the answers. Yes. And that's why we will ask these good questions. And by answering the questions for other folks and receiving the answers from other folks, we can enhance our awesomeness and help others to be that way too.
There's a humility in that, I feel, right? Of just like recognizing that you're not all knowing, you're not supposed to know. And that sort of releases you from that bond that often leaders feel constrained by or limited by. It's like, yeah, I don't have to know. And there's like, there's a flattening of sort of the hierarchy. It's like, no, there's other wisdom in the room. How can I bring other people's wisdom into the space?
So that's that binary again coming up forward when you're talking about flattening the hierarchy, even using the terms like this happens to me all the time in leadership circles. So when I say leaders, then I should be clear that anybody can be a leader. Right. Because anybody can be a model for this Jedi work. And when I say Jedi, I'm not necessarily talking about the Star Wars Jedi, although you can make the analogies with that in itself, but Jedi meaning justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so sometimes when I say leaders, oh, and I should make mention about the Star Wars thing. What's interesting about the Jedis, first of all, that was part of my prenuptial agreement that I had to watch Star Wars. Now my ex-husband is my ex-husband, but it is something I had to watch. But what I found really interesting is that those Jedis that they would train, those Jedi Knights or whatever they call them, they would steal them. They would steal these children from their home because they thought they had the capacity to bring it. So it's not that they were of an elite class or something. These were stolen children. So there's an interesting analogy to the 60s scoop that happened here in Canada, also to all of the kids who went through the residential schools. These people were stolen people, yet they can rise up and all of the DNA that they've held inside of them, all of the generational joy that they've got through the centuries of time can sometimes rise forward, and they can share that Jedi knighthood to show other people, no matter what they've been through, all of the excellence and all of the, well, excellence is not a good word, but all of the possibility for the future. So what I was getting to in terms of this hierarchy, some of the wording that a lot of these so quote unquote leaders, like say, for example, if they're executives or they're presidents of organizations or whatever, they constantly talk about expertise. But that word expertise or expert, again, is in that binary, putting yourself in this position that you have to know everything. Right. But when you talk about an exchange of using the word experience rather than expertise, then again, you go through that flattening that you were talking about. Mm-hmm. That I may have experience doing one thing, again, with my own intersectionality, with the own experiences that I have. You may have gone through the same thing, but because you live in a different place, your kids are different age than me, you've had different work experience, you might have a different experience. And both of our experiences are valid. It's just how do we use that experience to make those folks around us elevated, or to amplify their voices, or to serve in a different way, or do our work, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. And even thinking about, yeah, the piece around leadership and really honoring the leadership of everybody, like everybody has leadership. And how do we share our power versus power over dynamics, or even power under? How do we share it so that everybody gets to come in and have a voice and contribute to the whole?
Absolutely. I mean, that's where equity comes in. That's where inclusion comes in. And it's not to say that everyone always has to have a say, because sometimes that's not practical.
Yeah.
So we're not talking about living in communities where everything has to be decided by the whole every time, because that's not necessarily efficient. Of course, there's some people who have aptitudes towards something as well. So we have to consider their aptitudes, their characteristics, their wants, their goals, desires. Like for me, I'm terrible at working online on social media. I don't like doing it. I'm not good at doing it. So it's not something I really do very often. And for those of you who are watching or who are listening, if you look me up, you won't necessarily find that much on me. Kind of have to find me under rocks and under stones or through Isha, because people come to me for a specific reason. And they come to me because I am a good match for them. But it's not because I had a huge social presence online. And that's okay, because all of us have our aptitudes. All of us don't have to be doing everything out there. There's enough folks out there in the world.
Yeah, I'm curious. I want you to share for the listeners, like how you came to be in this work, and how this work has been part of your life and what you offer to it. What has been your journey?
Okay, so you're asking a question. Okay, so for those listeners out there, I'm just going to prepare you, because I am going to be talking about some difficult things, and Isha asked me the question. So just 3 quick grounding exercises I'm going to offer for those folks who are listening. So the first one is a tap. So you can tap anywhere in your body, so you recall that you are here now in this moment in time. You're present, not somewhere else. You're here with Isha and Farah at this moment in time. The second thing you can do is you can rock back and forth, forward and backward, side to side, because you activate that spine of yours, which is connected to your neurological system. And it also activates what might have been our tail. So what we have is our 2 feet and our tail, which creates a tripod, which of course is more stable than just 2 feet on the ground. So that's another way of connecting. And a third thing that I can offer is a cross body action. So you can take one arm and move it over to the other side, so you cross the midline, or take one foot and cross it over the other foot. So again, you cross your midline so you don't get stuck either in your right or your left brain, so that you always are shifting back and forth. You use your whole self. So now to go answer to your question. I started off working with Holocaust survivors. And so working with Holocaust survivors, at that time, it was in the 80s. They were people who had lived through the Holocaust in the concentration camps. And I found that a way to help process some of the work that we were doing with them was through movement, through drama, through the arts, because it was a way to connect to the visceral self, as opposed to the mental, only the brain side of things, because there were so many things that were locked way down deep inside.
Yeah.
And so this was my start into a window of the possibilities of how, if we focus on the things that are not valued in the same way that they are, or they weren't valued in the same way that they are now, but if we focus on our whole selves, we can work on that well-being side of our things. Yeah. From there, I started to investigate more into dance movement therapy, learn about the other therapies. And at the same time, I started the Dance Movement Therapy Association in Canada, co-founded it with some other colleagues of mine. But myself, I didn't actually go through the program. And the reason why that I didn't is because I found where I come from and whom the people I was working with was not connecting with that Western-based philosophy. It wasn't connecting with those Western ideas, those Western ideals, those Western values. So I didn't want to go through a system and be held down by an order of certification. I hire a lot of therapists, I hire a lot of psychologists, social workers, other creative arts therapists to work alongside me. But for the work I do, I don't want to be bound by those systems. In the course of this process of me uncovering whom I work with, I also discovered a part of myself that I didn't really know very much about. And that had to do with my own personal ethnography connecting to my parents' side. So Isha mentioned at the top of the show, the part of who I am as a warrior, and that's because of my lineage. One of the tribes that I'm part of are Patan people. They are warrior people. The other side are Khwaja people. They are healers. And one of the things with the healing people that I realize that I have is synesthesia. So my my senses are not connected the same way that some folks who are listening are. So with synesthesia, I was able to see and hear and process and feel things and smell things maybe in a different way and understand things in a different way. So that was a very lucky thing that I discovered, because in the process of my life, I've been through a couple of violent and very violent situations. So when I was 12 years old, I was gang raped. And again, you have those grounding exercises. I'm apologizing in advance if I've triggered you in any way, shape, or form, but it is part of my story. Then again, the year that I got divorced, that year I was raped again, not by my ex-husband. It was a person whom I didn't know, but because I had this synesthesia, because I had this ethnography that I knew about, my personal background, my generational strength, my ancestors who were alongside of me, and also because of how I saw my past, that I'm constantly moving forward from my past, I was able to process everything that happened to me and use this knowledge to help other folks who weren't necessarily going through the same personal circumstances that I have, but who'd been through some type of adversity. Because I've seen adversity from so many different perspectives, through the violent situations that I've been through some of the other traumas in my life that I've gone through the people whom I've worked with, the Holocaust survivors, the child soldiers whom I've worked with, the war survivors, refugees, the orphans, street kids, et cetera, et cetera. And so for all of this led me to this point where I focus specifically on that fearless and flawsomeness, so that we can, no matter what circumstance we've been through, we can continue to move forward from our past in a way that is audaciously visible, so that we are not silenced, that our stories have meaning, have value, have reason, have worth, and we deserve to be seen.
Yeah, I love that. Like the piece around, we often have so much shame around our trauma, and there is so much silence around the trauma, but to really use the story to support other people, right? To use the experience in service.
Yeah. And at the same time, to recognize not only do we serve the community around ourselves, but we serve ourselves.
Yeah.
And that's something that sometimes we forget as healing people, or people who work in service industries, or the moms who are out there, the coaches or community workers, etc. Sometimes we get so focused on helping other folks, we forget that we also need to serve ourselves. Mm-hmm. We need to think about who are those other fearless and flawsome people we need in our lives, so that we also can be served, because we need to maintain some sort of harmony. Again, I stick away from that word balance, because realistically speaking, I do spend more time working than I do having fun in my life. So that idea of balance, what it does for me personally, it constantly makes me upset, because then I'm like, oh, I'm spending too much time working or whatever. So I can't use that word anymore. So instead I use the word harmonize. So how do all those people harmonize into my life, so that if one part disappears, one group of people are missing, or if I need strength, that the other people are all sort of attached to me, so that I can always be held up in some way, shape, or form.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Like healing the healers and supporting the healers. Yeah. Yeah. And especially, I'm just thinking about like how much healing is needed, right? Especially when you think about like the opening we have now to do a lot of the ancestral work, right? Before, people were not really talking about ancestral healing, at least not, Western. It wasn't part of mainstream Western the way that it is coming in now. Yeah, like there's a really big opening to do this work. So yeah, so important.
So that's why it's so important, if we can center Indigenous knowledge, then we will have that stronger foundation for everything that we do. And that Indigenous knowledge could come from the territory that you're sitting on right now. Like, for example, I'm here in Tio'tia in Turtle Island. However, I am from 2 tribes. I am an Indigenous person, but not from this territory. I'm not First Nations, I'm not Métis, I'm not Inuit, but I try my best to center First Nations, Métis, and Inuit knowledge because this is the land that I live on. This is the place where I'm raising my children. But when we take the knowledge that is from the land and we take the knowledge that is parts of our own heritage, parts of our own history, or parts of people whom we really connect to. Oftentimes, if we really connect to a person or a group or like an art form or cultural form, there might be something way back in our own history that is calling us to that. Because maybe what is part of us has either disappeared or been subverted. So there's something there. So if we start to go back to these past ways of doing things and start to uncover the roots of why they started to exist, sometimes we can move our lives forward in ways that we haven't thought of in the past. And that's not to say we had to do exactly what is done as in the past, because of course, technology changes, viruses changes, people changes, and pace changes. So we have to make modifications to them. But by taking this Indigenous knowledge and centering it, that's the way that we can guard the earth. It's the way we can guard communities. We can guard ourselves and also our families, those we connect to. And ultimately, we know that we're doing things in a good way. And by moving forward in a good way without trying to do harm or minimizing harm for other people out there, how can that be a bad thing?
Mm-hmm. Can you give an example of centering Indigenous knowledge or even feeling that like that connection to, I think you were saying, to other cultures that, you know, that maybe in your lineage somewhere you were connected to, but that it's decontextualized or that you don't actually have like thought knowledge or memory, but that there's, you feel pulled or drawn to it. Like, can you give an example of that for the listeners?
Sure, I'll give something from my own life. For a long time, I was really attracted to Afro-Cuban folkloric music. So the music of the Orishas, the Yoruba music. And there was something in the drum, there was something in the connection between the singing and the dancing and the way that it was led and the fact that each of these dances and movements had meaning. And so when I explained that to people, they're like, oh, well, Farah, your territory that you came from is very close to India, so why don't you connect to Bharatanatyam dance, which also has strong connection to the drum, the singing, close connection to all of the deities, also the meanings in all of the movements. But actually that dance, Bharatanatyam dance, is not connected to my religious or spiritual practice because foundationally I grew up as a Muslim. Whereas the movements and the music and the sounds and the rhythms and the way that things were moving forward with the dances that I do with the Afro-Cuban folkloric dance, I didn't understand, but there was something there that I was connected to. As years passed and as I learned more and more about the traditions and about the ways of movement and the way that my own body felt, as I was doing these movements, I learned that these movements, these sounds, also the singing is very close to the rhythms and the patterns of words. Like, of course, the words were not the same, but the patterns of the way that things were sung and the rhythms, the syncopated rhythms, and also the feeling is very close to, again, my dad's side, the Khwaja side, and the connection to like the way that the Sufi practitioners practiced in the past. And so this was something that I suppose got lost in time, but it was something that was activated in me being here in Canada, connecting to Cuban, Afro-Cuban music coming from like from the area of Peshawar.
And
I'll give an,
what do
sorry,
you
go ahead.
say, no. What do you say to people who say that's cultural appropriation? Like that's
I'm glad you asked that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So for me, it's how you end up working with whatever you discover. So if you're using that to your advantage and for the advantage of other people, if you're using it, then for sure it's cultural appropriation. But if you're feeling it and you're absorbing it and you're connecting to your own values and you're respecting who is on the other side, then from what I speak to other folks out there, That is cultural appreciation. So there's a big difference between appreciating the other and appropriating the other. So when, for example, we do these dances, or sometimes because I am at a level where I can teach, but I don't teach the dances saying that I'm teaching you Yoruba dances. When I teach saying that, okay, we are going to teach, like if I can, I bring another instructor with me. And in fact, most of the time there's a Cuban person there who usually is coming from a spiritual background. But if they're asking me specifically to come, then I will say that I'm coming at this from a Western-based perspective. And so you're learning this secondhand. So this is coming through the filtering of my identity. It's not the authentic version of it. It's coming through this other way. And so you have to accept that it's coming from this other methodology. And so either you take it for knowing that information, or you decide you'd rather go with somebody else. But I'm very, very upfront about that.
That's an important disclosure. That's an important disclosure, like saying like this is coming secondhand and it is coming through this filter. Right? And really allows the person to make a decision about whether or not they want to receive that from you, but also giving them a way to go find the origin.
That's right. And find the origin for themselves, and they can find it out. Like the other thing is that I understand the origin from all of the people whom I've connected to, because that's based on my experience. But I'm not a quote unquote expert. Like I was saying before, they might go out and do their own research and search, because again, I'm not going to hand everything to them on a platter. They might go and find their own research as to why they want to do it and find something totally different. Maybe instead of through Cuba, they find the connection through Benin or Nigeria, which is a very different way of practicing. So again, like it's to find your own connection and to be respectful of where that connection came from, to acknowledge where you learned, where that connection came from. So in case there was an error made, you can trace backwards and say, okay, this is where the fault line occurred. This is where I need to go back before and say, okay, course correct, or find what was before that, where that split ended up happening.
And sometimes, I mean, you know, there have been times where I've been affected by music that I sense, you know, yes, African drumming, and even sort of gypsy music, or like Hungarian, which are not necessarily part of my lineage. I can't necessarily say that they're not, but even it can even be connected to a past life, right? Like beyond, you know, and we don't always know why we're affected, but I'm hearing just to allow yourself to be moved by, like, have it be medicine, have it be sort of for your healing, and to have it transform you also.
That's right. Like, I mean, I'm connecting to the arts, but you can do it in your own practice. Like, say, for example, wherever you're located right now, find out who are the traditional people, or who are the medicine people, or who are the First Nations, or like the Native Americans, or whatever you call them in your territory. Who were those people on those land? Where are they located now? Are they on the reserves? Where are they? How can you connect to them? Can you go to a powwow? Can you reach out to them? Is there literature that's out there? And then how can you connect it to your own practice? So for example, there are events that I run, and they have nothing to do with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit culture or people, but I still invite them to come. And I always give space up from whatever I'm doing. And I say, for example, if this is a 3-hour event, this 15 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes is going to be for them, because I honor the land. So again, it's about centering those voices, not to be tokenistic, but it's because I honor the land that I am in now. And I honor that they have guarded this territory before I got here. So by centering them and saying that, you know what, it's not about, it has to fit with the theme or the idea behind running this event. Because if we're running it on this territory, it's automatically part of the theme or the idea. You know, or if you're doing conference, you bring them in. You say, okay, you're going to sit on part of the board or whatever. We're going to give you space. And in fact, you've got like 3 votes instead of 1. So again, it's not about being tokenistic. It's about, what do you have to say? Like, you have this knowledge. What do you want to tell us, if you choose to tell? Because there are certain times I've brought people on board and they want to observe and they want to listen. And that's okay too. And also to give space and time and moments to reflect. because it doesn't happen at the same pace that you expect things to happen. That's a Western base, like that's a colonized model to have things happen right away, but to allow time for stillness, because stillness is different than silence. To allow stillness.
The trust to unfold too, right? That there's a relationship that you're inviting folks into a relationship to the land, right? Your relationship with a group of people, and this group of people with you, or another group of people, and that takes time to develop and unfold.
Yeah, it's not going to happen. You're not going to do your first event or have your first gathering or whatever, and they're going to come right away unless you've built a relationship with them. And also, it's not going to happen right away necessarily. It may or may not, but it may not happen right away that you invite them in and that everything is easy. It may not be easy, but it's part of that conversation that has to happen. Because if we don't center Indigenous knowledge, what is going to happen to us and this earth and everything that has come from who we are as individuals, no matter where we've come from this world? So we need to start to recenter so that we can decolonize. Like that is part of decolonizing. We can't just say that, okay, we're only going to focus on this aspect. It's a total shift that we need to do. And so, like you mentioned at the beginning that about the shift disturbing people, like, Farah, that sounds like shit. And I'm like, I know, but that's okay. And like culturally, people are like, ah, or they say cultural stripper, like Farah is a stripper. That's really not good to be saying as a Muslim girl. I'm like, that's okay. Like we need to change these ideas of what things mean so that we can go back and really fight for what they stand for and do what we really want to do, as opposed to what other people think we have to do.
Yeah. There's two questions that I want to ask, but what was dropping in for me as you were talking about like the centering piece, I heard a voice say that it was about like the survival of humanity, like our humanity will survive, or how do I say it? Anyway, it's about preserving these our relationship, how we relate to one another, that it's important to begin shifting our mentality and the way we relate for our own survival, because our disconnectedness right now is leading us to our own demise, and centering Indigenous wisdom will help basically support our survival and ultimately our thriving.
Yeah, I mean, how many people do you know who are saying right now they're unwell? They're so stressed. They've got so many different diseases or problems or issues that we didn't necessarily identify or have generations past. It's because there's been so many disconnections that we've been facing that we're breaking inside and we're breaking in community. And this pandemic doesn't help either, because now people are losing the ability to maintain relationships, to have conversation, to talk, just to talk, to build that relationship. People are losing those skills. So if we continue to isolate ourselves and to put ourselves into silos, what's going to happen to us? I'll give something else. So if you think about, I was talking about the past and always thinking about the past and moving forward from the past instead of making those demarcations. Some people, when they say, like even presenting grounding exercises, they're like, we don't want you to fall into the past. And so when you're talking about falling into the past, there's almost that implication that there's a leaning back in the past, right? That you're going to lean back, you're going to fall down, you're not going to be okay. Or that you don't want to run forward into the future. And when you think of yourself running forward in the cartoon sense, then you're sort of at an angle, leaning forward, and you're going too far forward, you're going to fall forward, thinking about all those things you need to worry about, all of that stuff that you need to put together. Did you do enough? Again, there's that leaning. So it's either a leaning forward or a leaning back. So what I challenge people to do is to think about it differently. Instead of leaning forward into the future or leaning back into the past, instead, if you need to ground yourself, what happens instead if you allow yourself to fall down into your ancestors? Because the way that I see my ancestors is that everything that they've offered to me is to elevate me to this position that I'm in now. Because for me, my ancestors are below my feet. They're not up in the sky. I'm working my way, and my kids will work their way above my shoulders to move higher and higher in this life. but it's my ancestors beneath my feet who brought me to this moment in time at this level where I am. So instead of leaning forward or leaning back into the past or leaning forward in the future, I allow myself to relax into the arms of my ancestors who are below me, to give me that time for stillness so that I can take time to reflect, to reroot myself, to ground myself into the ground. So when I'm ready to do so, I can stand up again and continue to work and move upward.
I really like that. I really like that. There's something, I usually talk about sort of the earth beneath your feet, but just thinking about being held by your ancestors, like having your whole body cradled by your ancestors is really empowering, is really feels like a place where you can rest and a place where you can sort of like let your shoulders hang a little bit and feel safe.
Mm-hmm. And even if you're adopted or you don't know what your past is, those ancestors are still there for you. They're still beneath your feet. And if you don't believe in the ancestors, you still are standing on the ground. I can bet you majority of people who are listening believe in gravity. So the gravity is still holding you in place. So you can still sink down to the ground to allow the ground to hold you in whatever way you need to. Exactly. Instead of thinking of it moving backwards or moving forward, thinking about it in those terms, that to sink down, to allow yourself to rest, to reflect, to be in stillness, not in silence, to be in stillness. So that when we're ready, we can get up and be visible again.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That is great. Tell me a little bit, you said when we were talking about centering Indigenous knowledge and inviting people into whatever you're putting out there, program, etc. What are some of the, you said it's not always easy. What are some of the difficulties and challenges that you've run into?
That's a good question. So like everybody, there's those people who are still hurting. Yeah. They're still going through their own challenges, their own adversity, their own trauma, their own history of connecting with people. And there's other people who are ready to build bridges, who want to connect to the other. Mm-hmm. So for example, even when we were talking about like connecting to a culture, if that culture is not ready to build bridges, you need to, again, give respect to them and leave them alone until they're ready to make that bridge, that they are ready to accept that appreciation. Because if they're not ready to accept that appreciation, you're always going to be disrespecting them. So there are people whom I've met who have not been ready to build those bridges yet. And so like even in the Black Lives Matter movement, there's some people who say, Farah, I know you're a person of color, but we're more marginalized than you are. And so therefore we need to do this, that. I respect that. And so I leave that alone. In which case I may not be able to serve that community. That's okay, because there's millions of people in the world that we can serve. If one population doesn't work for us, then that's okay. It happens, for example, like say, for example, I've had other folks, we've worked together on different teams. We've brought in First Nations elders to work with us, alongside of us in programming. And there's been misunderstandings that happen. And sometimes that misunderstanding doesn't come from what we've said, but there's assumptions that are made because there's been so much past hurt from the past that it's sometimes not about us. It's about the others processing. And it's the fact that they still need to be convinced that we want to make that bridge with them. Yeah. And so it's hard. It's really hard sometimes, because sometimes we feel like we didn't do anything wrong and we don't want to put blame on ourselves and we don't want to create more harm. But sometimes it just happens. And we recognize that maybe it's the way that we move forward. It wasn't perfect. We move forward in a flawed way. Maybe that provoked or caused something. But life is an experiment. So you continue, you learn from an experiment, you make your hypothesis. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. Yeah. So it didn't work that time. Okay, you move forward and you try a different manner, and hopefully that will work. But it has happened in the past where things haven't worked out and people have felt they were hard done by. People have felt like they weren't ready or it wasn't the right time. But in all of those cases for myself, I waited a couple of days, couple of weeks, couple of months, and I don't lose that relationship with that person. Mm-hmm. I reconnect with them. even though it's hard. I reconnect with them and allow them the opportunity to tell me again, like either I say I'm willing. So either to tell me again, I want nothing to do with you, or I'm ready now to engage. And so that's why even the people whom there were challenges like 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, because a lot of stuff has happened in Canada, there hasn't been anybody that I've lost a relationship with. I've always been able to keep connection. And even if it's just that we write to say hello from time to time, we don't ever work together, but just even to maintain the connection.
Yeah.
So it's an effort, but it's worth doing.
Yeah. I mean, you know, even the way that you and I have maintained our connection has been remarkable. And you are someone who is so open to staying connected over long distances, over difficult circumstances. Like, you are extremely open, and that's such a gift to the work that you do, that openness and that compassion, that willingness to listen, right? That openness, I think, is amazing. Farah, thank you so much for being here today. And I want to, let the listeners know how they can find you. Maybe not on social media, but how they can find out more about your work and about what you offer, because you offer some really amazing training sessions.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can find me on some social media. I am on LinkedIn. I am on Facebook. I am on Instagram. I do have a website, which is in construction right now. But if you look up my name, so my name actually is Farah Fancy. So I'm sure Isha will post that somewhere. But if you look up my name, I'm the only one. So it's the only one you'll see in Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. So you'll find me there. And for those of you who are interested, you just reach out to me. Don't be shy. Send me an email, send me a Facebook message, Instagram message, have a chat with me. Ask for me to come and meet with you. I will just find a way to schedule it in. We'll have 15-minute, half an hour chat. And again, it's not about creating a transaction. It's not because I'm trying to sell you something or because I want something from you, or hopefully you don't necessarily want to sell me something in return, but it's just about building a relationship, because who knows what will that lead to in the future? Who knows? But yes, I offer trainings on various themes connected to decolonization, respect, also microaggressions, the law when it comes to harassment. Those are some of the things, but I also run retreats too. So we haven't gotten that started again because of COVID, but I do run retreats in Mexico and Costa Rica, and we always connect with the Indigenous folks who are on the territory or learn about some of the cultural things that are happening. Like in Cuba, we go and meet with the Babalaos. We go to different ceremonies. In Costa Rica, then we go and see the dolphins, and we go to the tribes that are out there. Or else in Mexico, we go and we meet with the folks who are running in the Chimampas, doing still the work that the Aztecs used to do in the past. Connect with Frida Kahlo, find that resilience. Oh, and I have to say about resilience too, that resilience is a word that I've always used. So like, we're constantly learning and we're constantly unlearning. So I was speaking with this elder the other day, and she's like, Farah, why do you use that word resilience? And I say, because that's what we have to do, because it creates strength. We have to, like, I gave my spiel as to why we use resilience. She's like, Farah, like, why don't we talk about cultural joy or cultural vitality instead of resilience? Because resilience comes from a place of resistance or a place of struggle, that we're pushing against something that is coming. Why don't instead we just let go of all of those struggles and all of those difficulties that we're facing or that we're always going up against, and we assume that that doesn't exist, and we focus on cultural vitality instead. And I thought that's so amazing. But yeah, I hope that we can get to it. So I've slowly started to take even the word resiliency out of the way that I speak.
Yeah, there's people who talk about resiliency as being sort of this, like having to keep a stiff upper lip, or having to like keep a strong spine in the face of adversity. And it isn't about pleasure or relaxation or softness or receptivity, right? So yeah, the joy, and that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I love that. I love that.
I hope that the listeners out there can find some way to experience some joy in their day to day. Or if their day is over, that they go back and they think about, what is the joy that I experienced? And then carry that into tomorrow.
Yeah. Beautiful, Farah. Thank you so very much Love you, my friend. Thank
Love you
you.
too. Thanks for having me.